The village of St. Mary Mead was currently enduring a spell of unseasonably heavy fog, the kind that transformed the familiar silhouettes of the vicarage and the post office into spectral, unrecognizable shapes. Within the OT-panelled library of Gorse Hall, however, the atmosphere was far more oppressive than the weather outside. The master of the house, Lord Alistair Stirling, sat in a high-backed leather chair, his gouty leg propped up on a velvet ottoman. He was a man whose wealth was matched only by his profound capacity for spite, and tonight he had gathered his disparate relatives for what he called a domestic reckoning. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the ticking of the grandfather clock. She had been invited by Alistair's sister, Honoria Stirling, under the guise of providing company for a lonely old woman. But Jane knew Honoria's real motive. She wanted a witness who could be easily overlooked. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes watched the room's occupants over the top of her spectacles. There was Edward Stirling, Alistair's nephew, a young man whose expensive tailoring could not hide a desperate, hungry look in his eyes, and Clarissa Vane, a distant cousin whose quiet, watchful demeanor suggested a woman who had spent a lifetime calculating the cost of her own survival. "I have brought you all here," Lord Alistair began, his voice raspy and thin, "to inform you that the testament I drafted last year is no longer to my liking. It has come to my attention that gratitude is a commodity as rare as integrity in this family. Therefore, I have prepared a new document." He tapped a heavy, wax-sealed envelope resting on the desk before him. "It shall remain in this room, locked in my desk, until tomorrow morning when my solicitor arrives. Only then will you discover who among you is still Stirling in more than just name." The announcement was met with a silence so thick it felt tangible. Honoria's hand flew to her throat, her pearls clicking against her collarbone. Edward's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze landing momentarily on the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. Clarissa merely adjusted her shawl, her expression as unreadable as the fog outside. "Now," Alistair wheezed, "leave me. I wish to reflect on the nature of loyalty in total darkness. It is, I find, the only way to see clearly." One by one, the family left the library. Miss Marple followed last, pausing at the threshold to see Alistair extinguish the final lamp. The room was plunged into a deep, impenetrable black. As they gathered in the hallway, the sound of the library door being locked from the inside echoed through the house. It was a firm, final sound of a man who believed he had secured his world against all intruders. An hour later, the household was startled by a muffled, heavy thud from within the library, followed by a sharp, metallic clatter. Honoria screamed, and Edward threw himself against the heavy oak door. It took several attempts before the lock gave way, and the group spilled into the room. The fog from outside had somehow managed to seep through the heavy curtains, giving the library a ghostly, ethereal quality. Lord Alistair was still in his chair, but his head was slumped forward at an unnatural angle. The heavy brass paperweight lay on the floor, stained with a dark, wet shadow. Most strikingly, the wax-sealed envelope on the desk had been torn open, its contents missing. The room was cold, the fire having died down to a few glowing embers, and the only sound was the wind rattling the window pane. Miss Marple did not join the frantic rush toward the body. Instead, she stood by the door, her eyes fixed on the small silver inkwell. It had been overturned, and a trail of dark ink had dripped onto the carpet, forming a peculiar, jagged shape. "The poor man," Honoria sobbed, clutching Clarissa's arm. "To die like this, in the dark, and with his last wishes stolen." "It wasn't just the dark," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the wool in her bag. "It was the silence that followed. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Willoughby at the chemist's shop. He was so careful to lock his doors every night, yet he always forgot that the smallest mouse can find its way through a crack in the floorboards, if the cheese is tempting enough. A very organized tragedy, indeed." She looked at the window, noticing that while it was shut, the latch was not quite engaged. It was a detail that suggested an exit, or perhaps an entrance, that had been planned with the same precision as the fog itself. The testament was gone, and the master of Gorse Hall was dead, leaving behind a house full of people whose grief was far less certain than their greed. The morning after the tragedy at Gorse Hall, The heavy fog had lifted only enough to reveal a village consumed by a far more opaque cloud of speculation. In the cosy, cluttered confines of the St. Mary Mead post office, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the electric thrill of a high society scandal. The death of Lord Alistair Stirling was not merely a local tragedy, it was a conversational feast that the villagers were eager to consume. Mrs. Pringle, standing by the counter with a purposeful grip on her shopping basket, was already disseminating a theory that involved a secret passage and a vengeful former valet, while Miss Weatherby countered with the suggestion of a family curse that struck only when the moon was in a particular phase. Miss Marple stood by the display of garden seeds, her pale blue eyes watching the play of expressions on the faces of her neighbours. She noted how the shock was gradually being replaced by a predatory curiosity regarding the missing testament. To the village, the theft of the envelope was far more intriguing than the blow to the head that had ended Alistair's life. It transformed a murder into a puzzle of inheritance, and in a community where everyone's financial standing was a matter of quiet but intense scrutiny, the stakes were understood by all. "It is a very distressing business, Jane," murmured Dolly Bantry, who had arrived in her car with a burst of excitement. "They say the library door was locked from the inside." And Alistair had always been terrified of burglars. To be struck down in his own fortress, with his own paper-whited, is almost too Shakespearean for a Tuesday morning. The village is saying that Edward must have done it, given his debts, but I can't help but think of that quiet Clarissa Vane. Always looks as though she's counting the silverware. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her needles beginning their soft click-clack as she walked with Dolly toward the tea shop. "Gossip is like the ivy on the church wall. Dolly, it covers the structure so completely that you forget what the stone underneath actually looks like. Everyone is focused on the locked door, yet they forget that a lock only works if the person inside wants to stay in. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Henderson, the draper. He was so convinced his wife was stealing from the till that he locked himself in his office every evening to count the receipts. He never realized that she didn't need to get into the office because she was simply changing the prices on the tags before the items were even sold." Inside the tea shop, the atmosphere was even more charged. The local solicitor's clerk was sitting in a corner booth, surrounded by three of the village's most persistent busybodies. The talk had turned to the contents of the New Testament. If the document was truly gone, the family would revert to the previous will, which divided the estate equally between Honoria and Edward, leaving Clarissa with nothing. This fact had not escaped the village's collective memory. The general consensus was that Clarissa had the most to lose from a new will, while Edward had the most to gain from the old one remaining in force. "People assume that motive is a straight line," Miss Marple said to Dolly, as they waited for their scones. "But it is more like a tangled ball of wool. You pull on one end, and three different knots tighten elsewhere. The village sees the greed of the young and the desperation of the poor, but they overlook the quiet resentment of the ignored. I noticed how Honoria was looking at the inkwell last night. She wasn't looking at the ink, she was looking at the pattern it made on the carpet. It was a look of profound recognition, as if she had seen that particular mess before, perhaps in a nursery many years ago. It is a mistake to think that old age erases the rivalries of childhood. As they spoke, a police car screeched to a halt outside. Inspector Slack emerged, looking as though he had spent the night battling both the fog and his own temper. He marched toward Gorse Hall, ignoring the polite nods of the villagers. The reaction of St. Mary Mead was a mirror of the crime itself, cluttered with irrelevancies and fueled by ancient grudges. While the village debated the logistics of the locked door and the physical strength required to wield a brass paperweight, Miss Marple was thinking about the ink. It was a small, messy detail in a room that had been prepared for a very tidy execution. The village saw a grand drama of stolen fortunes, but she saw a household where the shadows had been used to hide a very specific kind of domestic failure. The pattern was beginning to form, not in the loud proclamations of the post office, but in the quiet, fearful glances exchanged between the survivors of Gorse Hall. By the following afternoon, Gorse Hall had been transformed into a hive of unproductive policing. Inspector Slack had spent the morning dusting every surface of the library for fingerprints, only to find a bewildering overlay of the entire family's marks, for Alistair had been a man who frequently summoned his relatives to fetch and carry for him. The inspector was currently obsessed with the mechanics of the locked door, convinced that a clever arrangement of string and a key must have been employed to turn the bolt from the hallway. He was so busy peering through the keyhole that he failed to notice Miss Marple, who had arrived under the gentle pretext of returning a borrowed book on Victorian lace to Honoria Sterling. Miss Marple found herself standing alone in the library for a few brief moments while the inspector was arguing with a constable in the foyer. The room felt colder than it had the night before, the heavy oak shelves seeming to press inward. Her gaze did not settle on the blood-stained carpet or the locked door. Instead, she moved toward the fireplace. The housemaid had swept the hearth clean that morning, but Miss Marple knelt with surprising agility to inspect the grate. There, caught in the iron scrollwork at the very back, was a tiny, unburned fragment of paper. It was no larger than a postage stamp, but it bore the distinctive blue tint of the high-quality stationery Alistair had used for his correspondence. "How very interesting," she murmured, her fingers delicately retrieving the scrap. "It reminds me so much of old Mrs. Ledger's cooking. She was always burning the grocery bills she couldn't pay, thinking that if the paper vanished, the debt vanished with it. But, as I told her at the time, ash has its own story, if you know how to read it." Someone was very anxious to dispose of something in a great hurry, yet the fire was almost out when they did so. She tucked the fragment into her knitting bag, just as Inspector Slack burst back into the room. He looked at her with a mixture of exasperation and pity. "Now then, Miss Marple, this is a restricted area. We've found no sign of a forced entry at the windows, and the door was bolted. It's an inside job, clear as day. Edward Sterling is our man. He was seen pacing the hallway at midnight, and we've found he owes £5,000 to a London bookmaker. He killed the old man to stop that new will from being signed, and he's hidden the documents somewhere in this house." "It is a very logical conclusion, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, smoothing her gloves. "Edward has always been a rather impulsive boy. It reminds me of young Tommy Bond, who broke into the schoolmaster's desk to steal the exam papers, only to find he'd stolen the wrong year's results. But tell me, Inspector, did you happen to notice the tongs? They are leaning against the left side of the fireplace, yet Alistair was right-handed and always kept them on the right. It is a small thing, but people are such creatures of habit. To move a fire iron when the fire is nearly dead suggests someone was poking at the embers with a very specific purpose." Slack snorted, dismissive of what he considered domestic trivia. "Tongs? I am looking for a stolen testament and a murder weapon, not studying the habits of a dead man's fireplace. Well, find that envelope, and when we do, Edward will be under arrest before tea." Miss Marple left the room quietly, her mind already moving past the inspector's obvious suspect. She wandered toward the morning room where Clarissa Vane was sitting by the window, staring out at the receding fog. Clarissa's hands were perfectly still, a stark contrast to Honoria's constant fluttering. Miss Marple noticed that the sleeve of Clarissa's grey wool dress was slightly singed at the cuff, a tiny blemish that most would overlook as a household accident. "The fog is clearing at last. Clarissa," Miss Marple said softly, settling into a chair nearby. "It is a relief to see the garden again. Though I always think that when the mist goes, it reveals things we might prefer to keep hidden, like the time the pond dried up in St. Mary Mead and revealed where the vicar's nephew had hidden all those empty cider bottles. We often try to burn our mistakes, but the smell of the smoke lingers long after the flames are gone." Clarissa did not flinch, but she tucked her hand deeper into the folds of her skirt. The early investigation had provided Slack with a motive and a suspect, but it had provided Miss Marple with something far more telling: a discrepancy in the fireplace and a signed cuff. The pattern of the ink on the floor, the missing testament, and the misplaced tongs were beginning to weave together into a story that had nothing to do with a nephew's gambling debts and everything to do with a woman who had decided that the darkness was the perfect place to rewrite her own future. By the following morning, the atmosphere at Gorse Hall had curdled into one of open hostility. Inspector Slack had officially moved from observation to interrogation, sequestering Edward Sterling in the morning room for a grueling session. The inspector's voice, a rhythmic bark that carried through the heavy oak doors, hammered relentlessly at the young man's lack of an alibi. Edward's defensive that he had been unable to sleep and had spent the night pacing the sounded thin and rehearsed even to the sympathetic ears of the household staff. To Slack, The case was a straight line, a desperate air, a crushing debt, and a locked room that offered the perfect cover for a crime of opportunity. Miss Marple sat in the small breakfast parlour, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, persistent pace. She was ostensibly focused on a complex cable-stitch pattern, but her attention was actually centered on the silver inkwell she had seen in the library. A diligent maid had moved it to a sideboard, but the stain on the carpet remained a jagged, splattered star of indigo. She thought of the way the ink had pooled, and more importantly, how it had failed to pool. It reminded her of the time the local grocer's son had claimed to have accidentally knocked over a bottle of bluing agent in the cellar. The boy had been very convincing until Miss Marple pointed out that the splashes were only on the tops of his boots, which was quite impossible if the bottle had truly fallen from the shelf to the floor. "It is a very curious thing, the way ink behaves in the dark," Miss Marple murmured to Honoria Sterling, who was nervously shredding a silk handkerchief beside her. One would expect a man struck down suddenly to collapse forward onto his desk. If the inkwell was on the right side of the blotter, as it always was, the spill should have moved toward the window. Yet the stain on the carpet is nearly 3 feet away, near the heavy velvet curtains. It suggests that the inkwell didn't fall because of a struggle at the desk, but because someone was moving toward the window in a very great hurry. Honoria looked up, her eyes wide with a frantic sort of exhaustion. "Does it matter where the ink is, Jane? My brother is dead, and Edward is being treated like a common criminal. Alistair was a difficult man, but he didn't deserve to be bludgeoned with his own paperweight. And that missing envelope, if they don't find it, the police will never stop hounding poor Edward. I am sure they will find something, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "but perhaps not what they expect. I was just thinking about the local drama society's production of The Midnight Guest last year. They used a very clever trick with a mirror to make it look as though a phantom was walking through a closed door. Everyone was so busy looking at the ghost that no one noticed the stagehand moving the furniture. We are so easily distracted by the grand gestureth locked door, the stolen will that we ignore the small, messy reality of a spilled bottle of ink." Miss Marple stood up and made her way back to the library under the pretext of looking for her spectacles. The room was empty now, the inspector having moved his theatre of operations elsewhere. She knelt by the heavy curtains, her fingers tracing the hem of the velvet. There, invisible against the deep crimson fabric to anyone not searching for it, was a damp, sticky patch of ink. It wasn't a splash, it was a smear, as if someone had wiped their hands in desperate haste. The first suspects are always the ones with the most obvious needs, and Edward Sterling certainly had those in abundance. However, Miss Marple was considering the physical movements required to kill a man in total darkness. If you cannot see your victim, you must feel your way. And if you feel your way across a desk cluttered with pens and inkwells, you are bound to make a mess. She thought of Edward's Hansclean, manicured and trembling. Then she thought of Clarissa Vane, who had spent the morning in the garden, scrubbed clean, but with that telltale sign on her sleeve. Ink was key to moving the offence. It told a story of someone who had reached for the testament, knocked over the ink, and then realized they were marked. The locked door provided the mystery, but the ink provided the geography. As she heard Slack's triumphant shout from the morning room had found a pair of Edward's shoes with a trace of library dust on them, Miss Marple merely sighed. The inspector was building a case out of dust and debt, while she was looking at a smear of indigo on a curtain and a tiny blue scrap of paper in a cold fireplace. The pattern was diverging. One path led to the obvious, and the other led to the truth. The heavy silence of the library at Gorse Hall was a physical weight, but it was a weight that Miss Marple found conducive to thought. While the rest of the household was distracted by the arrival of a second police vehicle, she took the opportunity to examine the one receptacle that Inspector Slack had deemed too mundane for a second glance, the wicker wastepaper basket beside Alistair's desk. Most of its contents were typical for a man of Alistair's, exacting nature-torn envelopes from bills already paid, a discarded draft of a letter to the parish council, complaining about the noise of the church bells, and a few crumpled circulars. However, at the very bottom, hidden beneath a layer of shredded advertisements, Miss Marple found a small discarded scrap of wax. It was not the red wax used to seal the missing testament, but a fragment of white paraffin, the kind used for common household candles. She held the tiny flake up to the light of the window, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. It was a singular anomaly. Gorsehall was fully electrified, a luxury Alistair had insisted upon years ago to prove his modernity, and the library was brightly lit by several ornate lamps. There was no functional reason for a candle to have been used in this room, especially not on the night of a murder that Alistair had insisted take place in total darkness. It reminded her of the time the local baker's daughter claimed she had been sitting in the dark to save on the lighting bill, yet she had a faint smudge of soot on her nose that could only have come from an old-fashioned tallow lamp. People often use a small light to navigate the darkness they claim to embrace, never realizing that the light leaves its own distinct trail of evidence. Paraffin, Miss Marple whispered to herself, the knitting needles in her bag shifting with a metallic clink as she moved. A very clean-burning substance, yet it leaves a residue if one is not careful, and Alistair was very particular about his darkness. He wanted to sit in the gloom to test the loyalty of his heirs, yet someone else wanted to see exactly where they were striking. It is difficult to bludgeon a man with precision if you cannot see the silhouette of his head against the chair. She stepped back from the desk, her gaze moving from the wastepaper basket to the heavy brass paperweight that Slack had taken into evidence. Had the killer used a candle, they would have needed a free hand to hold it. That would mean one hand for the light and one hand for the weapon. But the testament had also been taken, and the envelope torn open. That required two hands for the paper and one for the light. It was a matter of simple arithmetic that did not add up unless there was a third factor involved, or unless the darkness had not been quite as absolute as the survivors claimed. She wandered out into the hallway, where she encountered the young housemaid, Lucy, who was tearfully polishing the banister. With a few sympathetic words about the tragedy, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the household supplies. She learned that several candles had gone missing from the pantry earlier that week, a fact that the cook had attributed to the laziness of the modern youth. But Lucy also mentioned a more peculiar detail. She had found a small, greasy spot on the library floor 2 days ago, near the window, which she had scrubbed away with great difficulty. "It wouldn't come off with just water, Miss Marple," Lucy sniffled. "It was like someone had dropped a bit of wax right there by the curtain. I thought it was just the master being messy, but he never used candles." Miss Marple thanked the girl and walked toward the morning room, her mind piecing together the geography of the crime. The paraffin in the basket, the wax by the window, and the singed cuff she had noticed on Clarissa Vane were forming a constellation of facts that Slack's focus on Edward's debts could never encompass. The New Testament that Alistair had boasted about was likely the reason for the light. Someone had not just wanted to kill him, they had wanted to read what he had written before they decided whether to destroy it or keep it. It was a crime of verification as much as a crime of violence. The hidden clue was not the weapon or the missing paper, but the wax that proved the darkness was a theatre for a very private inspection. Miss Marple thought of how Clarissa had always been the one to fetch Alistair's tea, the one who knew his routines better than anyone. If Clarissa had been the one to bring a candle into that room, she wouldn't have been looking for the money Edward so desperately needed. She would have been looking for the one thing Alistair could never give her, the truth of her own status in his eyes. The pattern was shifting from a simple theft to a cold, illuminated betrayal. As she watched Slack lead Edward toward the police car for further questioning, Miss Marple knew that the boy was being punished for his visible greed, while the invisible light of a paraffin candle was pointing toward a far more patient and calculating heart. The following morning, the atmosphere at Gorsehall had shifted from a state of acute shock to one of simmering, claustrophobic suspicion. With Edward Sterling being detained at the local station for further questioning, a deceptive quiet had settled over the house, yet the air in the morning room felt as though it were being drawn through a sieve of unspoken resentments. Miss Marple sat by the window, her needles working a soft, dove-grey wool. Across from her sat Clarissa Vane, whose composure remained as brittle and translucent as fine porcelain. The conversation began, as it often did with Miss Marple, on a tangent of domestic observation that seemed entirely disconnected from the violence of the library. "It is a very difficult thing, Clarissa, to be the quiet one in a family of loud voices," Miss Marple remarked, her gaze fixed on a stitch she was carefully picking up. "I remember a young girl in St. Mary Mead, Mary Higgins. She was a distant cousin to the wealthy old Miss Hartnell. Mary did everything for that woman read to her, managed her accounts, even mended her lace when her eyes began to fail. Everyone assumed Mary was a saint of patience, but I always noticed that she never quite smiled with her eyes. She was not a saint, she was a creditor, waiting for the day when her years of service would be recognized in a final, tangible way. When the recognition didn't come, the transformation was quite startling. It is a dangerous thing to let a person believe they are indispensable and then treat them as an afterthought. Clarissa's hands, which had been resting in her lap, tightened ever so slightly. "I have no idea what your Mary Higgins has to do with me, Jane. Alistair was my benefactor. He gave me a home when I had none. Whatever his faults, I am grateful for the roof over my head. Gratitude does not require a smile. Gratefulness is a very flexible word," Miss Marple replied gently, "but I happened to find a small photograph tucked inside that book on the place I returned to Honoria. It was an old picture, taken in the colonies many years ago. It showed a younger Alistair with a woman who looked remarkably like you, Clarissa. Not a cousin, I think, but someone much closer. Alistair was a man of many secrets, but his pride was his greatest weakness. He would never admit to a youthful indiscretion that resulted in a daughter he had to hide away as a distant relative. To be a Sterling by blood, but a servant by title-fat, is a very bitter pill to swallow for 30 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the clock. Clarissa turned her head to look out at the grey, drizzling garden, her profile sharp and unforgiving. "He told me that night, just before he extinguished the lamps. He called me into the library and laughed. He said the New Testament would ensure that I remained exactly what I had always been, a ghost in his house. He told me that blood meant nothing without legitimacy, and that Edward, for all his faults, was at least a public name. He was going to leave me a small annuity, barely enough for a cottage in the village, while the rest went to a nephew who had never done a day's work in his life. And that was when you decided that the darkness he wanted was the perfect opportunity," Miss Marple said, her voice filled with a quiet, grandmotherly sorrow. "You didn't go to your room when the others did. You had the candle ready, hidden in the folds of your shawl. You knew the house, you knew the geography of that room in the dark better than anyone. You went back to talk to him, perhaps to plead, or perhaps just to see that document for yourself. And when you saw that he truly meant to discard you, the paperweight was right there on the desk, a moment of absolute, blinding clarity after 30 years of shadows." Clarissa finally looked at her, and for the first time the mask of the quiet cousin fell away to reveal a cold, focused intellect. "You think you know everything because you watch people in a village, Jane, but you don't know what it's like to wait for a life that never starts. I didn't mean to kill him when I went in. I only wanted to see if he was lying. But when I read that paper by the light of my candle, I saw the words. He called me a faithful companion. Not a daughter, not Sterling, just a companion. The ink was still wet on his signature. I reached for the document, and he tried to grab my arm. The inkwell went over, and in the struggle, I wanted him to stop talking. I wanted the silence to be real." She stood up, smoothing her dress with the same meticulous care she had used for years. The confrontation had not resulted in a scream or a collapse, but in a cold admission of a life spent in the service of a lie. Miss Marple watched her, knowing that the secrets of Gorse Hall were now laid bare, but also knowing that a confession in a morning room was not the same as a conviction in a court of law. The pattern was complete, but the most dangerous part of the game was yet to come. Clarissa had spent her life being invisible, and she was not about to let a few smears of ink and a singed cuff be her undoing without one final, desperate move. The following morning, a startling discovery by the estate's solicitor, Mr. Greaves, threw the entire investigation into a state of absolute chaos. He had arrived at Gorse Hall to formalize the master's affairs, only to reveal that Lord Alistair, in his characteristic atmosphere of distrust and double-dealing, had not written just one testament. Fearing that his family might attempt to coerce him or destroy his final wishes, Alistair had secretly mailed a carbon copy of the New Testament to the solicitor's office the very afternoon of the murder. When the document was read aloud in the drawing-room to the assembled family, the silence that followed was not one of shock, but of profound, ironic bewilderment. The document revealed that Alistair had indeed been playing a much deeper game than anyone had suspected. While he had mocked Clarissa Vane and threatened Edward, the actual contents of the Rewritten will left the entirety of the sterling fortune to a charitable trust for the preservation of Victorian naval history, leaving both his nephew and his distant cousin with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a modest 3-month allowance to find new lodgings. The New Testament that everyone had been willing to kill for was, in reality, a death warrant for all their aspirations. This revelation shifted the focus of the crime entirely. If the testament Alistair had brandished was a document of communal ruin, then the person who had stolen and destroyed it wasn't trying to hide a specific inheritance. Sethi were trying to prevent the world from knowing they had been disinherited entirely. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the room, her knitting needles clicking with a sharp, thoughtful intensity. She watched the faces of the survivors as the solicitor spoke. Honoria looked faintly relieved, as if the loss of the money was a small price to pay for the end of the tension. Edward, who had been returned to the house under police escort, looked physically ill, his dreams of settling his gambling debts vanishing like smoke. But it was Clarissa Vane's reaction that held Miss Marple's attention. The woman remained perfectly still, but her eyes were fixed on the empty fireplace, where the blue scrap of paper had been found. "It is a very common human failing, Raymond," Miss Marple whispered to her nephew later that afternoon in the garden, "to assume that because someone is acting with great purpose, they must have a great prize in mind. We all thought the thief was looking for a fortune, but it turns out they were merely looking for a reprieve. It reminds me so much of the time the local schoolmaster burned the registers. Everyone thought he was hiding his own poor grades from his youth, but it turned out he just couldn't bear the thought of anyone seeing how few students had actually attended his lectures. Pride is a much more frequent motive for destruction than greed." This new twist reinforced the killer's deception. By destroying the original document, the murderer had hoped to fall back on the previous will, which had been far more generous. But they had not counted on Alistair's habit of duplication. The existence of the carbon copy meant that the murder had been not only a moral failure, but a tactical one. The person who had struck the blow in the dark had been killed by a pile of ash. Inspector Slack, however, was now more convinced than ever that Edward was the culprit. He argued that Edward, having peeked at the document earlier in the day, realized he was being cut out and acted in a fit of rage to destroy the only evidence of his disinheritance. Miss Marple, however, was looking at the logistics of the carbon copy. She realized that if Alistair had mailed the copy in the afternoon, he had already decided the fate of the family before the test of loyalty even began. The darkness of the library hadn't been a place for him to make a decision. It had been a place for him to savor the secret knowledge of their upcoming ruin. She thought of the paraffin wax and the singed cuff once more. The Second Testament changed the motive from getting to preventing, but it didn't change the physical movements in the room. The pattern was now one of a double cross that had backfired. The murderer had tried to rewrite history in the dark, only to find that history had already been mailed away in a stamped envelope. As the evening fog began to roll back in over the damp fields of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation would not be about money at all, but about the moment the killer realized they had destroyed their soul for a document that didn't even exist. The shadows in the library of Gorse Hall seemed to have deepened since the solicitor's departure, as if the house itself were mourning the loss of a fortune that had never truly been within its grasp. Miss Marple sat in the chair opposite Lord Alistair's desk, her knitting bag resting on her lap, a picture of elderly domesticity that stood in sharp contrast to the cold, clinical atmosphere of the room. She had requested a moment with Clarissa Vane, under the polite pretext of discussing some old family embroidery patterns, but the air between them was thick with a very different kind of tension. Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced a thick, wax-sealed envelope, identical in every outward respect to the one that had vanished on the night of the murder. She placed it deliberately on the desk right next to the silver inkwell. "It is a very strange thing, Clarissa, how documents have a way of appearing just when one thinks they are lost forever," Miss Marple began, her voice as smooth as a polished pebble. "I was speaking with Lucy, the housemaid, earlier this morning. She was clearing out the tall boy in the Gallerite one with the loose floorboard behind Aitan. She found this. It seems Alistair was even more suspicious than we realized. He didn't just make a carbon copy for the solicitor, he made a third, handwritten version. which he must have hidden away as a safeguard against his own forgetfulness. It hasn't been opened yet, but I imagine it contains the truth about everything. Clarissa's eyes remained fixed on the envelope, her face a mask of iron-grey composure. If such a thing exists, Jane, it should be handed to Inspector Slack immediately. It is not for us to sit here and speculate on its contents. Alistair was a man of many tricks, but even his tricks must eventually come to an end. "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said, her needles starting their steady, rhythmic click. "But I was thinking of poor Mr. Benchley, the chemist in the village. He once tried to hide a very serious mistake in a prescription by placing a second, identical bottle on the shelf, hoping no one would notice the swap. He thought that by creating a duplicate he could erase the original error, but he forgot that a duplicate always invites a comparison. I couldn't help but notice, Clarissa, that when I placed this envelope on the desk, your first instinct was not to reach for it, but to look at the tongs by the fireplace. It is a very specific reflex, isn't it? As if you were remembering the heat of the embers rather than the value of the paper. Clarissa stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked toward the fireplace, her hand hovering near the brass fire irons. "You are a very imaginative woman, Jane. You see patterns in shadows and tragedies in knitting patterns. But a handwritten document found by a housemaid is hardly a reason for a psychological drama. If that is indeed a testament, then the solicitor will handle it. But that is the curious thing, Clarissa," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "This envelope is empty. I prepared it myself this morning with a bit of wax and some old stationery. I wanted to see if you would be relieved that the truth had been found, or terrified that your sacrifice had been in vain. You see, I know you didn't just kill him for the money. You killed him because you couldn't bear the thought of being a companion for one more day. And when you read that document by the light of your candle, you realize that he had won even in death. You burned the original testament not to get the money, but to hide the final insult. You wanted us all to believe he had intended to leave you everything, only for the paper to be stolen by a common thief. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of truth. Clarissa turned her head, her profile sharp against the afternoon's dying light. A small, bitter smile touched her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a woman who had finally been seen. He laughed, Jane. Even when the ink was splashing across the desk and the weight was in my hand, he was laughing. He told me that a daughter who has to hide in the shadows is nothing more than a shadow herself. I didn't want the money after that. I just wished he was wrong. I wanted the world to think he had loved me in the end." Miss Marple watched her, her heart heavy with the weight of 30 years of redirected life. The final test had been passed, not with a scream, but with a quiet, devastating admission. Clarissa had been a ghost in the house, and she had committed a murder to give that ghost a dignity it had never possessed. She hadn't been fighting for a fortune, she had been fighting for a narrative. The pattern was now visible in its entirety, a tragedy of pride, played out in the dark with a paraffin candle and a brass weight, all for the sake of a lie that had finally been extinguished by a simple, empty envelope. The following morning, the library of Gorse Hall felt less like a crime scene and more like a confessional, as the various members of the Sterling family gathered at the request of Inspector Slack. The inspector was still clutching his notes on Edward's gambling debts, his face a mask of stubborn certainty that the case was all but closed. Miss Marple, however, sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, quiet authority that eventually drew every eye in the room toward her. She did not speak with the booming confidence of a policeman, but with the gentle, terrifying clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the small, messy ways in which human beings fail one another. It is a very natural thing to look for the person with the loudest motive. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice a soft ripple in the tense atmosphere. "Edward had the debts, and he certainly had the desperation. It reminds me so much of young Arthur Pringle in St. Mary Mead, who was accused of stealing the churchwarden's silver because he was known to be a bit of a spendthrift. Everyone was so busy looking at his bank balance that they failed to notice the churchwarden's own daughter was the one who had taken it, simply because she was tired of being treated like a piece of the furniture. In this house, we have all been very guilty of looking at the money and ignoring the person who actually held the candle." Slack frowned, his brow furrowing with impatience. The candle. What has a candle got to do with a blunt force trauma and a stolen will? We've got the locked door, the missing envelope, and a nephew who was seen pacing the hall. The geography of the crime is perfectly clear. The geography is indeed clear, Inspector, but you have the wrong map, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes fixing on Clarissa Vane. Alistair insisted on total darkness to test his airs, yet the crime itself was one of remarkable precision. To find a specific envelope, tear it open, read its contents, and then strike a man with a heavy paperweight in a room filled with furniture requires more than just luck. It requires light. I found a fragment of paraffin wax in the wastepaper basket, not the red wax of a seal, but the white wax of a common household candle. Someone in this room didn't want to wait for the morning to see their fate. They wanted to see it immediately, and they were willing to risk the darkness to do so. She paused, her needles clicking a steady beat as she continued. But it wasn't just the light, it was the ink. When the struggle occurred, the inkwell was overturned, splashing across the desk and onto the heavy velvet curtains. I found a smear of indigo on those curtains, nearly 3 feet from the desk, at a height that suggested someone had wiped their hands in a frantic hurry. And then there was the fireplace. Even though the fire was nearly out, someone used the tongs to push a very specific scrap of paper into the embers. I found a tiny, blue-tinted fragment of stationery caught in the scrollwork, same blue stationery Alistair used for his testament. Miss Marple turned her gaze fully upon Clarissa, whose face was as still as a frozen pond. I noticed a singed cuff on your sleeve, Clarissa, the very morning after the murder. It was a tiny blemish, easily mistaken for a domestic accident. But when you combine it with the paraffin wax, the smear of ink, and the fact that you are the only person in this house who truly knew the layout of that library in the dark, the pattern becomes quite unmistakable. You didn't kill Alistair for the fortune he was leaving to the Naval Trust. You killed him because, by the light of that candle, you read the words that finally confirmed you were nothing more to him than a faithful companion. You destroyed the will not to get the money, but to hide the fact that you had been publicly disowned by the man who was, in secret, your own father. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air out of the room. Inspector Slack looked from the elderly lady to the quiet woman by the window, his expression shifting from skepticism to a dawning, horrified comprehension. Clarissa did not deny it, she simply stood up, her movements as controlled and invisible as they had been for 30 years. The miracle of the locked door had been nothing more than the advantage of a woman who was already inside the fortress, armed with a candle and a lifetime of suppressed resentment. The pattern was revealed. A murder committed for the sake of a dignity that had been denied, unraveled by a smear of ink, a scrap of paper, and the sharp, unblinking eyes of Jane Marple. The following weeks in St. Mary Mead were characterized by a quiet, brooding stillness, as if the village itself were trying to digest a meal that had proven far too rich for its constitution. The departure of Clarissa Vane in a discreet police vehicle had been witnessed by many from behind their lace curtains, yet described by few in the days that followed. Gorse Hall stood empty now, its heavy oak doors permanently secured with a chain that lacked the mechanical elegance of the library's original bolt. The Midsummer Harvest Bazaar, which usually occupied the village's collective mind at this time of year, was remembered no longer for its prize-winning squashes or the vicar's opening speech, but as the period when the laws of family loyalty and the laws of the land had briefly, violently diverged. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows across her flower beds. She was working on a new pair of mittens, the needles clicking with a soft, persistent rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the distant, drowsy hum of the village. Beside her, Dolly Bantry was attempting to navigate the complexities of a crossword puzzle, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. The London lawyer's news had finally been confirmed. The carbon copy was indeed the final word on the sterling fortune. Edward had quietly slipped away to the coast, perhaps seeking a horizon that did not involve high stone walls or the heavy weight of a dead man's expectations. "It is a very strange feeling, Jane," Dolly sighed, setting down her pen. "To think that we were all standing right there in the hallway, watching a man be murdered by his own pride and a paraffin candle. It makes the world feel quite untrustworthy." One expects a villain to be a monster, not a woman who handles one's tea so efficiently. I shall never look at a silver inkwell the same way again without checking for smears. Miss Marple smiled gently, pausing to adjust a stitch. It is a common mistake, Dolly, to think that evil must wear a frightening mask. In my experience, the most dangerous people are often the ones who are the most orderly. They believe that because they can control the mechanics of a household or the wording of a contract, they can control the consequences of their own actions. Clarissa Vane was a woman of immense patience, but she lacked the one thing that truly keeps a person safe, a respect for the unpredictability of the human heart. She saw Alistair as a problem to be solved with a paperweight, and she saw the darkness as a friend to her secret. She forgot that even the smallest flame leaves a trace if the eyes watching it are sufficiently trained. The village had, in its typical fashion, found a way to move on while keeping the scandal alive in whispers. The story of the invisible daughter had become a local legend, a cautionary tale told over garden fences and grocery counters. The library at Gorse Hall was beginning to look a little neglected, the dust creeping over the edges of the desks where Alistair had once sat with such rigid purpose. Nature, it seemed, had no interest in maintaining the perimeters of a man who had tried to lock out the truth. I suppose it's all for the best, Dolly mused. But I do wonder, Jane, how you knew. It wasn't just the wax, was it? You looked at that inkwell as if you already knew it was a witness before you even saw the stain. I think, dear, it was because I have seen so many people try to build perfect lives, Miss Marple replied, her eyes distant and thoughtful. It reminds me of the old clockmaker back in my childhood. He spent 10 years building a clock that would never lose a second. It was a marvel of brass and silver. But the day he finished it, he realized he had forgotten to leave a way to wind it. He had been so focused on perfecting movement that he forgot the necessity of the human hand. Clarissa's crime was like clockwork. It was technically perfect, but it was spiritually hollow. A locked door always invites a question, Dolly. And once you start asking questions, the answer is usually much closer than you think. It is often sitting right there in the parlor, holding a tray of tea and waiting for the sun to go down. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the hollyhocks, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of peace return to her garden. The mystery was solved, the pattern was complete, and the village of St. Mary Mead was settling back into its comfortable, predictable routines. She picked up her knitting basket and stood, her knees creaking slightly in the evening chill. The world was full of people who thought they could turn the keys of fate at bay, but Miss Marple knew better. She knew that the only truly locked rooms were the ones we created within ourselves, and that eventually every door must swing open to the light.